In this section, we will discuss storage, file system management, and performance monitoring. A user saves files to hard disks which are on the server. But let's do a little bit of a review of terminology. What's the difference between a hard disk and a volume and a partition? Well, I think everybody knows what a hard disk is. A hard disk is a mechanical device that we save data to. But what's the difference between a hard disk and a partition and a volume? In this diagram, you can't see the difference because the partition occupies the entire hard disk and the volume occupies the entire partition. But let's look at the difference between a partition and a hard disk. A partition is a part of a hard disk or all of a hard disk. In this case, the C drive, or the first partition, occupies the entire disk. But here's an example of a disk divided into two separate partitions. One partition has been assigned the C drive, and one partition has been assigned the D drive. A disk can be broken into parts, called a partition. But now, what's the difference between a volume and a partition? Because in this case, I can't see a difference between the C drive, which is one volume, and the first partition, and the D drive, which is another volume, and the second partition. Well, that's because in this example, the volume occupies the entire partition, and you can't see the difference. The volume is the thing that gets the drive letter. So, if we implement something called a disk spanning, the D drive can be stretched across two separate partitions which are on two separate disks. So the volume is the thing that gets the drive letter. The hard disk is the mechanical device. A hard disk can include just one partition, or it can be chopped into multiple partitions, and the volume is the thing that gets the drive letter. It might only occupy one partition, or it might be stretched out across multiple partitions. Now let's discuss file systems. When you install a new disk, you typically have to format it, and you can format it as FAT or FAT32 or NTFS. Now, FAT stands for File Allocation Table, but FAT is an old file system that was used with old DOS, which nobody uses anymore. You would only use FAT if you needed it for backward compatibility. And FAT32 is a file system that was used with old Windows 98. You typically would not use FAT32 unless you were formatting, for example, a USB drive. But you typically would not use it to format a hard disk. Typically, when you format a hard disk, you are formatting as NTFS. Typically, when you format a new hard disk, you typically format it as NTFS. NTFS stands for New Technology File System, and it has quite a few advantages over the old FAT and FAT32. The biggest advantage of NTFS is it provides NTFS permissions, meaning we can give different people different levels of access to different files on the same hard disk. You can't do that with old FAT or FAT32. NTFS supports much larger partitions. It allows us to perform auditing so we can see who looked at which file. It allows us to perform encryption, which we've already talked about before, and it allows us to establish quotas. So let's start out by reviewing NTFS permissions. If you have a folder such as payroll and you don't want to have just anybody to have access to it, then what you do is you assign a user or group permissions to it. And this screen shows that we are assigning NTFS permissions to the accountant group so they will have access to the payroll folder. That's NTFS permissions. But now let's discuss what's meant by disk quotas. And a potential problem is if the user saves his entire DVD collection to his home folder on the server, and what that does is it fills up the entire file server hard disk and it slows everybody else down. In fact, then nobody can save anything because the hard disk is full. So the solution is to implement disk quotas. Disk quota establishes the user can save just so much data up to the server. So here's how we would do it. We would go to the C drive of the server, right-click, select Properties, click on the Quota tab, and then we would enable quota management, and we would deny disk space to users who exceed the quota. In this example, I am giving the user a quota of 10 gigabyte of disk space, and that's up on the server, not on the workstation, and the user will get a warning when he reaches 9 gig. Quotas are used to limit the amount of space that a user can use on the file server hard disk. Now, let's turn to the section on sharing files and printers. Now, previously we talked about what it means to share a file. You might have a server up here and it has a folder and you want users to be able to get to it. So what we do is we share that folder. And then after we share the folder, then users can access that folder, and that is called mapping a network drive. To review, if we want to share a folder, we go to the folder that we want to share, we right-click, we select Properties, we select the Sharing tab, and we select the radio button that says, the check box that says Share this folder, and that's all we have to do to share a folder. And then after the folder has been shared on the server, then users can map a drive to that shared folder, and mapping the drive allows them to access the shared folder. Now, let's look at sharing printers in Windows, at local printing and at network printing. Now, in local printing, the printer is connected directly to the user's workstation, and that way, if you had 100 employees, you would have to buy a printer for each individual employee, and that's kind of an expensive way to go. So what we do is we get a print server. A print server is a computer that has a printer attached to it, and everybody can send their print jobs to the print server, and that way we just buy one high-quality printer instead of 100 cheap printers. And then everybody can print to the print server, which pushes the print job to the printer. To share a printer, in other words, to allow users to connect to a printer on a print server, we go to the print server, and then we go to the printer, and we right-click on the printer and select Properties. All we have to do is click on the checkbox that says Share this printer, and when we do, it allows users to print to the printer. After we have clicked on the checkbox that says Share this printer, then that makes this computer, by definition, a print server because it can receive jobs from users. Users print to the print server, which pushes the job to the printer. Another option is to use a network connected printer, and that's where the users print to the print server, and then the print server forwards the job to a network connected printer. In other words, the printer is not connected directly to the print server, it's just plugged in anywhere to the network. And that way the printer does not have to be in the same room that the print server is in. The printer can be connected to the network closer to where the users are. The users print from the PC to the print server, which then forwards the print jobs to the network printer. Now, let's look at monitoring system reliability and performance. Event Viewer is a program that allows us to audit and to view error messages. If we go to Event Viewer, which is under the Computer Management Console, and under Event Viewer we select Windows Logs, we can see that we have the system log and the security log. The system log shows us any error messages that may have occurred. Here's an error message right here that says that the computer detected duplicate IP addresses. So this is error messages relating to computers. But if we select the security log, then this shows the audit log. It shows who logged on, who logged off, and who looked at which file. Event Viewer can show you what the computers have been doing, and you look at the system log to see what the computers have been doing, and the security log shows what the users have been doing. Now let's look at Performance Monitor. Most of you are familiar with Task Manager, and it shows you how hard the computer is working. But Task Manager is limited. It only shows you what's going on right now. It doesn't show you what happened a half an hour ago. So what we might want to do is we might want to use Performance Monitor. Performance Monitor can be found in the Computer Management Console. And we can use Performance Monitor to add key variables, such as we can measure how hard the CPU is working. And you can see at this example, the CPU is barely hitting 35%. And another variable that we can measure is we can measure how hard the hard disk is working. And you can see that this hard disk is working pretty hard. And another thing we can measure is how much memory we are using. If you look at the blue line here, that shows that our memory utilization is about 40%. So the red line is processor, and that's only hitting about 40%. And the blue line is memory, and that's only hitting about 40%. But the green line is disk utilization, and that is maxing out at 100%. So the bottleneck is the thing that is slowing the system down. And if the system is slow, it is our job to try to figure out why, to find the bottleneck. So if this server is operating slowly, is the problem we don't have a powerful enough CPU? Is the problem we don't have enough memory? Or is the problem that the hard disk is overloaded? And you can see from this output screen that processor utilization is only at 40 to 50%, that memory utilization is only at about 40%, but hard disk utilization is totally maxed out. So that would be our bottleneck, the hard disk. To measure how much activity is on the network interface card, what you can do is you can go to Task Manager and select the tab that says Networking, and that shows how much activity is on the individual network interface card. But Task Manager does not show you overall traffic for all the computers on the network. To do that, you would need a program such as Microsoft's Network Monitor. And you can see that it shows overall network utilization here is at about 54%, and it also shows how much network utilization is being taken by each individual computer. That's Microsoft's Network Monitor. Now, another program we use here at CCBC is called Wireshark. And you can see from this screen that network utilization is 50% for a while, and then it jumps up to almost 100%, and then it drops back to 50%. Monitoring and optimization. So it's our job as network administrators and network engineers to monitor and optimize. Monitoring means looking just to see if everything is okay. And if everything's okay, then don't do anything. Optimization means if you have hit a danger threshold, then taking action. Monitoring is looking, optimization is taking action. And in monitoring and optimization, we have 4 key variables to measure: CPU utilization, free memory, disk utilization, and network utilization, and we compare them against danger thresholds. And if any danger thresholds are met, then we take action. So what we have is we've got the key variables, the danger threshold, and the action. So the first key variable would be CPU utilization. And the danger threshold would be if CPU utilization is greater than 85%, and I don't mean it occasionally hits 85%, I mean it's at 85% all day long. If CPU utilization is greater than 85%, well, that's a problem. So then what we should do is take action. It might be to get a faster CPU, or to get a quad-core CPU, or to get a motherboard which has multiple quad-core CPUs, or even to get an additional server and to move several of the programs off of one server to our new server. That's one key variable. Another key variable to watch is making sure we have enough free RAM. And if free RAM is less than 15%, then that's a danger threshold. So what we can do is to install more RAM, or in the short term, we could just uninstall unnecessary programs which are gobbling up RAM. Another key variable is disk utilization. And disk utilization, the danger threshold is greater than 85%. And some people like to say greater than 85%. Other people like to say when utilization is approaching capacity, that is a danger threshold. So if we hit a danger threshold, then we take an action, such as getting a faster hard disk or implementing disk striping. And that's where the operating system can write 2 disks simultaneously. And then a fourth variable would be network utilization. If network utilization is high and greater than 50% is considered high, then we get a faster network. We upgrade from 100 base T to gigabit Ethernet, or if that doesn't do it, we might even need to divide our network into multiple subnets. So if the user says this network is really slow, we have to figure out, is the problem the server is dragging, or is there too much traffic on the network? And to make that decision, we bring up these 2 programs. To see if there's too much traffic on the network, we bring up a program such as Network Monitor or Sniffer, which allows us to measure traffic on the network. And to see if the server is working too hard, we look at Performance Monitor to see if the CPU is overloaded or to see if we don't have enough free RAM. What we do is we look at these key variables and we identify to see if any of them have hit a danger threshold. And if one of these key variables has hit a danger threshold, then we take the appropriate action. Danger thresholds can be expressed as absolute numbers or as a deviation from the baseline. For example, an absolute number of a danger threshold would be if CPU utilization is greater than 85%. 85% is our important number. But another danger threshold is when we get significant deviation from the baseline. So what's a baseline? A baseline shows average utilization over time. And this baseline shows us that for January, February, March, April, our CPU utilization has been at 20% for the last couple months. So that's our baseline. Baseline is the average utilization over time. Now, suppose you tell me that CPU utilization is at 60%. Well, I might say to you, well, 60% is not the danger threshold. 85% is the danger threshold. But if we compare it to the baseline, we will see that that is a significant deviation from the baseline. In other words, for the past several months, our CPU utilization has been 20%. And then in one day, it triples. It jumps from 20% to 60%, and we haven't added any new hardware or any new software or any new users. When we get that kind of a deviation from the baseline, that implies that something is wrong. So a danger threshold can be an absolute number, or a danger threshold can be a deviation from the baseline. Performing backups. I think everybody knows what a backup is. It's copying whatever is on the hard disk of the computer to backup tape, for example. Let's look at the contents of the hard drive. A hard drive contains an operating system, and it contains applications, and it contains data files. And if you have taken Introduction to Accounting, you know what an AR is. An AR is an accounts receivable. And an accounts receivable is a file that has a list of all your customers and how much money they owe you. And the reason we have an accounts receivable is so at the end of the month we can contact our customers and send them a bill and ask them to pay their bill. So if the ceiling falls in and trashes your computer, you could buy a new computer for $500 to $1,000 and that wouldn't put you out of business. You could reinstall the operating system and you could reinstall the applications. But if all the data files were lost, you would have lost your accounts receivable. An accounts receivable is a list of all your customers and the amount of money they owe you. And if you lose your accounts receivable, then you've lost the ability to collect, in this example, $35,000 worth of receipts. And if you lose your accounts receivable, then that can put you out of business. So the moral of the story is The most important thing in a computer system is the data itself. And that's why we perform backups. You can back up to a DVD, you can back up to a USB drive, you can back up to a secondary hard disk, but usually for larger operations we back up to a tape backup because it has a much larger capacity. It's not very fast, but it has a much larger capacity. Perform a backup copying our data files to some sort of media such as tape or USB drive. You can do a network backup, which is also called an over-the-wire backup, and that way you don't have to walk up to each individual server and perform the backup. What you do is you connect a tape drive to a whole box of tape drives, what they call a jukebox, and then you perform a backup over the wire from the servers to the tape drive. And that's the way we do it here at CCBC. But don't do this in the middle of the day because it will take up a lot of bandwidth and it'll slow the users down. Typically, you want to schedule this to happen in the middle of the night. Typically, you don't do the backup every day at midnight. What you do is you schedule the backup to happen. You configure the backup to happen every day at midnight, 7 days a week, or 3 days a week if you like. What's the difference between a normal backup and an incremental backup? A normal backup backs up all files, whether or not they have been changed. And an incremental backup only backs up files which have been changed since the last full backup. So an incremental backup doesn't take as long to do. And a restore is the opposite of a backup. If your hard disk gets trashed and you install a new hard disk, then you take your tape backup or your backup from a USB drive and copy all the data back to your hard disk drive. A UPS stands for uninterruptible power supply, and really it's just a battery in a box that you connect to the server, and it protects against power outages. So that way if the power goes out in the building, the UPS box can still supply power to your server. And this concludes our section on storage, file system management, and performance monitoring.